before we dive into live and look at all that good stuff, could you just tell us a little bit about your background? I mean, how did you start making music in the first place?
I was surrounded by musicians all my life. My parents sent me to music school really young because I was bored, so they had to keep me busy. So I studied piano and drums since the age of 6 or 7, and then I was playing in bands, and then around 15 or 16 I bought decks, and I was really into scratching, and then from there into DJing, and then started buying synthesizers when I was 18 or 19. I didn't have much of a social life, really. I was mostly playing, I was always in a studio, making music of some sorts. And then, when I was 25 or 26, I moved to London to make it a little bit more serious. I was working as an engineer for many years for a lot of producers. I studied sound engineering, and I was mixing records for some famous producers, and at the same time making my own music. And then some of them were like, you should release this. And then I started releasing, and under different alias for a few years. And then here we are. Many years later, I'm still doing exactly the same thing and loving it.
So you were ghost producing?
Yeah,
for want of a better term.
Sometimes. Other times I was mixing records for other people. So just the pure engineering side of it. Right. But in a couple of occasions, I've ghost produced.
What software were you using originally when you first started?
Well, I was using Cubase originally. That's been the program, and then I've been using mostly hardware stuff. You know, because until about 10 years ago, computers weren't that powerful, and when you needed to record something, you needed a sampler, or if you needed a drum sound, you needed either to sample it from a vinyl or you needed a drum machine. So I come from that era of saving money for a piece of kit that you would love desperately for 6 months, and then you got bored, and then you sell it and buy something else. And I'm still in that very circle right now. Never stopped.
Yeah, and your DJ, I mean, you've played obviously at loads of massive clubs. I mean, have you always been using vinyl? I
was into vinyl, and then about 5 years ago I switched to, pretty late, to CDs. And then when I finally started learning CDs, everyone switched to USBs. So I was like, okay. So I catched up now. I'm on USBs, ladies and gentlemen. No laptops still. I'm afraid I have too many drinks to have a laptop on stage with me. So I have USBs, it's,
Somebody else's equipment is fine, yeah.
Precisely, not mine, yeah.
So should we start this track, or maybe you could introduce what this track is?
When Declan invited me here, I was thinking what to bring with me, and this is not the computer I use in the studio, so I don't have all of my plugins. I use a dedicated computer studio. This is the one I use for traveling and to write down ideas. So I figured what I could do, I could bring a session from a recent remix I've done. This is a remix I've done, I don't remember, maybe in March. It came out in April or May. It's for an artist called Christian Nielsen. And basically, this remix was a little weird for me to make because this song was out on a label called Play It Down, Jesse Rose's label. And it was #1 on Beatport. It reached very, very high position. And when that became #1, they decided to go for some remixes. And Jesse called me, the owner of the label, and said that Christian Nielsen was a little bit of a fan, and he wanted me to remix it, which obviously is a big deal because it's a big song at the time. But I was in the middle of building my new studio. So at the time I had everything in boxes. I've got lots of nice hardware, toys and everything. At that time when I had to do this remix, I had pretty much nothing, only a MIDI keyboard and maybe one synth.
Was that quite nice though in a way to limit yourself?
Not really, but that was the only way I could do it, really. But, and also the deadline was pretty tight. I think I only had 3 or 4 days to do the remix. They always say, we're really tight, and then suddenly, you don't hear from them for 2 months later. Then, But so I had a very short time for that, and again, it was, quite a big deal because the song was really everywhere. Everyone was playing the original. So I asked for the parts, and also it was a little tricky because Christian didn't send me so many parts. He sent me only 4 or 5 sounds, which I think I have here. So I want to play you the original for a second. So it's a pretty big house record. The song was pretty good, so I checked out the parts, and I was like, okay, what do I do with this, And the one thing that I wanted to use was the vocal, because I figured that the vocal was really cool. I didn't want to make another sort of tech house remix because the original is already pretty big. So what I've done, I'll play you a little snippet of my version. I took it a little bit South American.
We can play as long as we pretend. We can dance with our souls intent.
Basically, my idea was, let's try to take this in a sort of a South American vibe, completely like not jacking house or whatever the original was. So this was the vocal that they sent me. It's all little snippets of
Give me something, yeah. Nothing diamond.
It already came with these reverbs as well, so I couldn't really do much with it.
And you should know the
So I used that and a little bit of the synthesizer, which I really liked. But then again, it's already very filtered, so it wasn't easy to put it in an arrangement because I was hoping it would be open and so you could then do something with it. This is a pretty closed sound. This was probably just some little percussion.
And they're only 13 seconds long.
Yeah, I mean, that's more than enough when you have like, no, the a cappella is a bit longer, the vocal. So now this is the session for my remix. It's a very simple idea because, as I said, I couldn't go quite crazy with like synthesizers and everything. So I wanted to go mostly percussive. So I would say 90% of the sounds are actually drum sounds. In fact, if I play it, you can see that the drums are the major part of the record. I remember the first thing I found when I decided to go a little percussive. I was looking for a good percussion sound, and I have a library of samples that I sample from vinyl, and I think this was the first sound that I found. This very nice South American vibe. Well, I spend a few days every month sampling from vinyl. I do that for many years, and I just try not to make songs for 2-3 days and sit down with vinyl and record samples and label them and put them in, hopefully, loops. So whenever I need something, I can just go back to my folder and find them. And especially with the remix, it's cool to have something to start straight away with instead of having to build everything from scratch. So my idea was, let's go South American, and I went into my South American folder, and it worked somehow. So this was the beginning, and then around this loop, I started working with some samples, and I think I was using a sample library. You can see where there are some 808 sounds, but they're already very distorted. They've been distorted into a tape, I think, so they sound pretty massive. This is a kick from an 808. And it is as it is. I mean, there were probably some other plugins that now we can't see, but that's pretty much the tone of it. And then if I add everything else, you can see they're all 808 hits from this sample library. But that, obviously like this, it's a pretty standard drums, but as soon as you add a little bit of this, then the whole attention gets shifted into this. It's less obvious in a way. So again, this percussion loop kind of gave me the whole idea, and then I was thinking if I needed like to add a bass line, but I didn't really want to have a bass line to it, so the subs of the 808 did the job. Then pretty much I was jamming on a loop for quite some time, and then I tried to use the vocals on it, and they were fitting okay.
let's ride. Let's ride so far. We can play as long as we pretend. We can dance.
So the main idea was basically out of having this a cappella looped and then trying to build stuff behind it. And then after, the main groove is there, after the 808 stuff was there, I only had plugins to use. So I've done some weird sounds with Diva, which is one of my favorite plugins. It does some pretty weird modular stuff. And I've exported it because I think it was pretty heavy for my computer. But basically with Diva, I did this, which at the time seemed a very good idea. But it's there in the background, and it kind of contributes. I wanted to have a little bit of weirdness, and then I actually added another synth, which was my favorite. But then Jesse Rose called me and was like, yo, I really love the remix, but that synth is a little weird. I think, to be honest, I have a version for myself with the synth on, but the one that came out actually doesn't have it. So I have a special, you know what I mean? These were all very, very simple sweeps with synths. But one thing that you can notice is that even though this was made almost all entirely in the box, I tend not to leave lots of plugins open. Like even when I make a sound with a soft synth, then I tend to freeze it and export it in audio, because then once it's there, then you can still do whatever you want to it, obviously, because with Ableton we can stretch it, pitch it up, pitch it down, add 1 million plugins, you know. But somehow having it audio, to me, it's kind of like, okay, you know, stop playing with that synth for 5 days and, you know, let's finish it. So lots of this stuff, I've recorded it. And this is something that comes from the fact that mostly now I'm working with external instruments, because some of them are very unpredictable. Being old synthesizers, basically what I do is whenever I find a combination or something I like, I would just export it. You know, I would just record it, tweak it for 10 minutes, and then, you know, think about it, and then go back and find a little part, a little loop that I want to use. And so I tend to use plugins the same way. I tend to like make a line and then export it or freeze it or record it, and then it's audio, then it's a commitment. You know, especially when you have to go a bit fast, you know, that I find that helps me. Otherwise, if I keep having MIDI, you know, I keep seeing so many possibilities of changing sounds and endlessly, you know, playing around. So in this case, this was the main idea. And I mean, after the whole Brazilian part, the vocals were fitting. And then you can hear that I've used also his synth. So even though it didn't sound exactly exciting, it kind of contributes a little bit to the function. And then again, other little sticks and like that's all ear candy, you know what I mean? Like after the main idea was there, I've arranged it really quickly, and then I've added little things like these bells, which happen very little and you can barely hear them actually. But after, you know, the main idea is there, then I like to add little things. And this is one of my favorite soft synths. It's called Ace, and it's a fake modular, and you can come up with some pretty weird sounds with it. Again, you know, this was more the case of trying to take the song somewhere completely different, and I just liked the idea of going percussive. And I sent a very quick draft to Jesse, and he really liked it, and he asked me if I could do a quick mix for him to play that night, which I did. Basically, once I had this arrangement, then I start applying the sort of processing that I apply to pretty much all of my tracks. I have certain elements, certain plugins, certain combinations of things which I use pretty much all the time when mixing. But this is something I take care normally. I try to have a couple of days where I completely forget about the song, and then I go back to it and then go into more technical details.
Yeah, and what would be your go-to chain for something like drums?
Normally, well, I like to use a combination of pretty strong compression. I mean, for example, Ableton itself, it comes with this glue compressor, which I find really, really amazing. It's an emulation of an SSL bass compressor. I've had the original for many years, and then I sold it because I think that some emulations nowadays are very much sounding, you know, the same, and you know they're cheaper and you can bring them around. And so the glue compressor particularly is the one thing in Ableton which I'm using all the time. And I have a go-to setting for drums, which is applying the glue compressor. I'm basically copying the settings from compressors which I've read many years ago that Dr. Dre uses in his music. And since I've read that, I figured sounds, you know, good for Dr. Dre, it's good for me. So the way I go about, for example, the drums, but it's pretty much the same on my master bass. I like to use slow compression. So see, in the glue compressor, you have all these fixed times for attack, and 30 milliseconds is the slow one, even though it's 30 milliseconds, so it's still pretty quick. I use slow attack, 30 milliseconds, and super fast release. The reason for doing that is because doing that, basically, with this type of compressor, with the bass compressor, you allow the transients of sounds to actually pass, you know, past the threshold. So you have some peaks of the sounds, and then after 30 milliseconds, the compressor works. And that, you know, quite aggressive compression after the peak pass basically allow the sound to become very punchy, very beefy. So I would use this very setting pretty much on all of my drums. So slow attack, super fast release. And another good thing of the glue compressor is that it comes with an EQ. So I would always have that on, because what this EQ basically does, it allows every frequency to pass. Basically, it tells the compressor not to compress anything below a frequency that we decide. So I would put it around 150, 120, whatever. Basically, anything below that stays uncompressed, stays clean. So the kick and the bass, it's, you know, it's there. It doesn't get compressed. And then the compressor takes care of the hi-hats and the percussions. And I don't know, these settings work for me, and I've been using them for years on my drums, but pretty much exactly the same settings. I have them on the master. And then on my drums, I would have Often I have an equalizer just after the compressor to take off everything below 40 hertz in case there is a bass line or there is a sub. In this case, the sub, this kind of distorted sub does the bass line. So I didn't do that. Otherwise, there would be no punch. But I would have that. And then my master chain changes. I gotta say, I always try different plugins. But I normally have a compressor, exactly with these settings, like for the drums, followed by a tape distortion simulation. There are many good ones, the UAD ones. There is one by UE. At the moment, I'm using one from Steven Slate, very good plugins. So I have that to give a little bit of beef. And then I use Saturn, another distortion unit from FabFilter. And that's pretty much it. And then before sending the track to mastering, I also use a mastering equalizer to remove everything below 30 hertz, which might seem a bit counterproductive because our music obviously has lots of low end. But the thing is that after checking out many of my records in sound system during the years, I found that even when we're really careful with mixing, there is a lot of build-up of bass coming from all the sounds that we add up. So having lots of energy below 30 hertz is a bit counterproductive because that takes a lot of space in terms of space in the song. And that excites very much limiters and compressors in the mastering stage. So removing that, basically we will still have a pretty powerful song in the club because the clubs, they have so much power into the subs. The amplifiers and the EQs in the clubs are often very beefy in the low end. So we don't really need a lot of below 30, a lot of subsonic frequencies in our songs. Those are conveyed anyways in clubs by subwoofers and speakers. And the mastering engineer does a much better job of handling that. So I just give a mix which has, hopefully is balanced, but doesn't have too much below 30 hertz, which is something that normally mastering engineers cut anyways. So I just do it before, so I check out myself how it sounds with that. Even all this processing that I'm talking about in the master, it's still very, very light. I don't go for more than maybe 3-4 decibels of compression on my master. It's just literally to create a little movement, to create a little push. And it's because I find out, to me, having this chain on the master when I already start the record, you get a little bit of a nicer sound already. So it's kind of a little bit more exciting to continue. Some producers have fixed chains on their masters, as in like they have already limiters and they basically master their tracks already when they're making them. And there is nothing wrong with it if you know what you're doing, I guess. But I find it a little bit dangerous because every track is quite different. I mean, personally, I like to start every track completely. I never use the same kick twice. In all of my records, I always start with a completely brand new drum kit. I would be very bored otherwise. So I don't really know how a fixed chain would behave with my music. But there are other producers which start. For example, most of their music is made with 909 drum machines, so they know exactly how to handle that frequency. So it works for them to have a pretty strong mastering chain in their music. I just have a little bit of compression, a little bit of tape distortion to have a little vibe, really. And then I leave the rest of the job for the mastering engineer.
When you've got a sample like this, which is really busy and is recorded from vinyl, how do you then get that to sit in with electronic elements?
Mostly with sidechaining. When you have such a busy pattern like this Brazilian congas, you can see, in fact, there is a sidechain there that kind of, see, without the sidechaining, it's cool. I mean, it's stretched nicely and whatever, but with the sidechain, if I add the kick, you can hear that it goes up and down with the kick. So, especially using quite busy percussions, I love percussions. I always use some percussions. And when you use single hits, it's a bit simpler. When you use stuff which is busy, like in this case, sidechaining is, in my opinion, the best thing to make it bounce together with the groove, with the groove of the record, creating that space. So sidechaining is obviously, it's used mostly in between kick and bass, as we know, to create space in between them. But it's really a very, very powerful tool for, to create rhythms, to kind of, make everything move together with the kick. But not necessarily with the kick. Sometimes I use sidechaining with other elements. For example, I would sidechain something with the kick, but then add a super long reverb, for example, and then sidechain the reverb to the clap or the hi-hats. That's a trick which lots of people have done before me, especially in the days of big, heavy electro house. There is that famous song, Satisfaction, by Benny Benassi, which was, even though it's not exactly my cup of tea, but it was very impressive in terms of production. And one of the things I remember that impressed me, the first time I heard it in a studio, I remember hearing that obviously it has a huge bass line, amazing big vocals, and the whole song is a hit. But I remember checking it out in studio and noticing that the reverb and the delays on the vocals were super sidechained with something which wasn't the kick. So being the whole song very pumpy, with this huge sidechaining on the kick, and the effects being sidechained or something different, it created a very weird environment, which I thought it was pretty cool. So sometimes I also do that. Generally speaking, I think sidechain helps pretty much making everything fit with the groove of your record. So that's the one thing I tend to use the most.
Yeah, and when you're mixing, would you treat things in groups together? Would you group things into like a stem bus in a way?
Depends. Like the drums, yes, always. Because it's quite convenient, really, and then you can, when you find a nice balance, then you can put them up or down without having to touch every single volume. And the drums I always do. I do also when I record vocals for my own tracks. So if I have a singer, normally, you would have 5 or 6 tracks in between the original, the main vocal and the backing vocals and whatever. And so those ones I group as well. So, you start applying compression and certain EQing on the group. It's basically to save some time. But before, back in the days, I used to really be really particular about grouping everything. Nowadays, I only group things, like, for example, if I have 2 sounds for a bass, then yeah, they would be grouped. So they're compressed together, they're sidechained together. So it really depends. The one thing I group always is the drums, because in every song of mine, they are like the biggest part of my songs is mostly drums.
In terms of arrangement then, just quickly, what's your approach? Do you just kind of let it organically play out? And this looks quite neat.
This has been, to be honest, this is a remix where, the vocal already was kind of doing half of the job. So it's been a very quick arrangement. Normally, when I do arrangements nowadays, I do them entirely live with push. So I would have play, in the clips view for quite some time. I would record all of my synths and everything and play with them. And then once I feel that the song is almost there, then I would jam for a long time, just jamming, recording myself. So sometimes I record 10 minutes, 15 minutes long jams thinking this is the most amazing song in the world. And then, then when you're back to normal after a coffee, then sometimes you're back to normal. Then, I reduce them and I go a little, and then I get into the whole automations and obviously a little bit more precise. But I mostly nowadays, my arrangements are done with push. So I don't copy and paste any more stuff in this view. I just do it in the other view, and then actually, I find it very amusing to stay in this view. And then the moment where I record the arrangement and come here, I kind of get into the whole, right, I got to finish this. So, then I get a little bit more technical and I go into automations and start putting equalizers and stuff. So until I'm in this view, until I'm jamming, it's like the fun part. And then obviously at some point you have to finish it. And that's when this comes. In this particular case, it was pretty easy because all I wanted to do was basically have the vocal on a Brazilian groove. To make it very different from the original. So in this case, it didn't take me long at all to make the arrangement. Some other times I have to try several times this live approach, jamming by myself. But the thing is, I often have friends in studio. So poor them, they kind of like listen to me going live pretty much every day for like 3 hours of playing them all of my tunes in Ableton. So actually like doing a live set for them. And sometimes I record it. So I have these different songs in a live setting. And then I go about and ask them which one did they like. But most of the time they're playing PlayStation when I do this. So then they're not even listening. But sometimes, I see them nodding when they're scoring at FIFA. And then I know that the song is a good one, sometimes.
That's the test.
That's the test, the FIFA test. It happens every day. You've been to my place, yeah. It happens every day.
What would be your one piece of advice you've learned, be it engineering or arrangement or whatever, for someone in mixing?
It's literally just about putting the hours in, you know what I mean? Like, it's fun, it's frustrating, it's the most amazing and also one of the worst jobs in the world, I find, because it's very frustrating. I'm sure that everyone in the room, we all love music, and it takes quite some commitment to sit down there in front of a screen every day, especially, when someone has a day job and then you come home and you're tired, the last thing you want to do is to learn what this compressor does, like what is compression. But, it's really about staying there and putting the hours in. Then obviously, there is a lot to learn on the internet, there is a lot to learn at point blank, there is a lot to learn smooth. There's a lot of ways to kind of improve. But it's it's hanging there. That's the only thing, because that's something I have to tell myself often. And most of my good friends are into this line of business, so it's a very boring environment. We only talk about plugins and the next scene. We always tell to each other at a certain point, hang in there, because there are moments where it gets really dark. There are moments where you have no ideas. You're not getting many remix offers, or you don't get many shows because maybe your last record wasn't very relevant. And those moments, sometimes you question, what am I doing? You know what I mean? But at the same time, hanging in there, it's really what makes it work. And I mean, we all can get a lucky break. We all can get the bomb track made in 2 hours. There are so many famous records that have been made in 2 hours. But, that's not how it normally happens. It can happen, and there are very famous examples of that. But the truth is that every single person I know that is into this business, that makes music and tours around the world as a DJ, they are sitting there almost every day, if not every single day. Sometimes doing a song, sometimes sampling, sometimes learning a new plugin. It's literally about putting the hours and sitting there even when you don't want. That's the most difficult thing, because on some days you really can't be bothered. Like you just are hungover and would like to go to the pub. And instead you have to do a song which conveys happiness and club bliss or something, and you have to do it. So that's the thing. I guess the advice that I always give also to my friends is just let's stay there, even though it's tempting to sometimes be like, okay. There is always something to do. It doesn't even necessarily you don't have to make a record every day. But again, trying something new, trying a new plugin.
Yeah, I was going to say, so if you find yourself in a creative rut from a compositional or songwriting perspective, just go through labeling your samples, or delete some plugins you don't use,
Absolutely.
or just do something.
Because then when you're actually inspired, the fact that you can go to a folder where you know exactly what is there. You're looking for a African whatever, stick whatever, and you sampled it 3 months before, but it's there, it's labeled, it's in a folder, and when you want it, you just drag it and it's in there. That keeps the momentum. And most, if not all, of the good songs that come out, they come from momentum. They come from that 1 hour of inspiration, and then there can be countless hours afterwards of editing, and that's the painful part. But it's important to be ready when that hour of inspiration time is there. And if you have everything labeled, if your plugins are there, if your samples are there, it's a bit easier than when you're very inspired and then you're going through 1 million clap sounds. That's kind of like, all right, I'll play FIFA, you know what I mean? Give me that, Barcelona, And, yeah, I know, I play Barcelona, it's easy, I know, but I'm not that good. I make music, see, my friends are better than me. I make music when they play, so, yeah. So, yeah, just, again, practicing and having everything in order, your computer, your plugins, your samples.